Dear weary traveler, precious soul who has found your way to this sacred sanctuary tonight, I see you there, settling into your quiet space, carrying within your heart the weight of another long day, another week of struggles that seem to multiply faster than solutions can be found, another season of questions that echo in the chambers of your mind long after the sun has set and the world around you has grown still. You have been searching, haven't you? Searching for something your restless spirit recognizes but cannot quite name. Something that feels like coming home, even though you may never have experienced it before in quite this way. Welcome, my beloved companion, to this haven of peace we have prepared together. This sanctuary where time moves differently than it does in the rushing currents of everyday existence. Where grace flows like a gentle river through parched ground that has been waiting far too long for refreshment. Here in this blessed quietude that exists beyond the harsh demands of productivity and performance, you can finally set down those invisible burdens you have been carrying on shoulders that were never designed to bear such weight alone. Finally allow your mind to stop its endless cycling through worries and plans and regrets, and dreams that seem to dance just beyond your reach. Take this moment to simply notice where you are right now, to feel the surface that supports your weary body completely and without condition. Whether it is the familiar comfort of your own bed, where you have wrestled with sleepless nights before, or perhaps a chair that has become your evening refuge, a place where you retreat when the noise of the world grows too loud and your soul cries out for the kind of silence that speaks more eloquently than any words could express. Allow your body to remember what it feels like to be held, without having to earn that support through effort or achievement or any form of striving that has become so habitual you barely notice how exhausted it makes you feel. Your physical form has served you faithfully throughout this day that is now drawing to its close, carrying you through conversations that drained your energy, responsibilities that tested your patience, moments of joy that felt too brief, and periods of difficulty that seemed to stretch on far longer than seemed fair or bearable. But now in this sacred space we share together, your body can finally rest, finally remember that it was created not for endless striving, but for peaceful dwelling in the love that sustains all existence. The love that breathes life into your lungs without your conscious participation and keeps your heart beating with rhythms more ancient than your thoughts. Let us breathe together now, you and I, sharing these moments of conscious connection with the gift of life itself that flows through you every second of every day, whether you are aware of it or not. Draw in slowly through your nose, allowing your lungs to fill completely with air that carries more than oxygen into your being, air that carries possibility and hope and the whispered promise that rest is not only possible but absolutely necessary for souls like yours that give so much of themselves in service to others and to the demands of daily life that never seem to decrease no matter how efficiently you try to manage them. Hold this breath gently for just a moment, not with tension but with the tender care you might use to cradle something infinitely precious. And now release it slowly through your mouth, breathing out not just carbon dioxide, but the accumulated stress of hours that required more strength than you sometimes felt you possessed, more wisdom than you sometimes felt you had access to, more patience than seemed humanly possible when faced with situations that tested every limit you thought you knew about yourself and your capacity to handle whatever life might place before you. Again now, drawing in peace with each inhalation, drawing in the deep assurance that this moment belongs entirely to you, and to the love that has drawn you here for purposes that transcend your understanding, but serve your deepest need for connection with something larger and more tender than your troubles, something infinitely more reliable than your own efforts to hold everything together. When it feels like the center cannot hold, and things are falling apart faster than you can put them back together again. Feel your chest expanding with more than air as you breathe in recognition that you are held by arms that never grow weary, supported by love that never wavers, surrounded by grace that never runs out, no matter how many times you need to return to this well of refreshment for your thirsty soul. And as you exhale, release all the things you have been trying to control, all the outcomes you have been worried about, all the people you have been trying to help or fix or understand, letting them go into hands far more capable than yours. Hands that have been caring for souls like yours since before time began and will continue, caring long after earthly time has ended. One more breath now, deeper and slower still, breathing in the knowledge that your presence in this quiet space is exactly where you need to be. That your journey here represents not escape from reality, but entry into a deeper reality, where love is the fundamental force that moves and shapes and sustains everything that exists, where grace is the prevailing atmosphere that surrounds every person who has ever drawn breath, or ever will, draw breath on this earth that God created and called good. Despite all the pain and brokenness that sometimes makes it difficult to believe in goodness, notice how your breathing has begun to find its own perfect rhythm without any effort on your part, like waves finding their eternal cadence against shores that have welcomed them for countless centuries, like your heart settling into the steady beat of someone who knows they are completely safe, completely loved, completely accepted exactly as they are in this moment, without needing to change anything about themselves to earn that acceptance or prove their worthiness to receive the comfort that is being offered so freely. You are not alone in this peaceful gathering tonight, dear friend. Though the darkness around you might whisper lies about isolation and abandonment that have no power over truth that shines brighter than any darkness could ever overcome. All across our sleeping world, other hearts like yours have been drawn to this same place of refuge. Other souls who understand what it means to feel, overwhelmed by the complexity of existence in times that seem designed to fragment attention and fracture peace. Other spirits who hunger for the kind of nourishment that cannot be found in any earthly provision, but flows abundantly from the source of all comfort and all hope. Some who join us tonight have been walking paths of contemplation for many years, their hearts familiar with these rhythms of grace, but always eager for fresh encounters with the love that first captured their attention and transformed their understanding of what it means to be fully alive in relationship with their Creator. Others may be newer to spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before, drawn by longings they can barely name but cannot ignore, pulled by hunger that has grown stronger with each disappointment that taught them earthly pleasures alone cannot satisfy the God-shaped emptiness within every human heart. Whether you arrive as a seasoned pilgrim who has walked many miles on spiritual journeys, or as a curious newcomer taking tentative first steps toward mysteries that seem both attractive and frightening, whether your faith feels strong tonight or fragile as morning mist that might dissipate with first rays of sun, whether you come with gratitude or with complaints, with hope or with despair, so deep you wonder if dawn will ever come again. You are equally welcome in this community of hearts that recognize their need for something beyond what this visible world can provide to souls that know they were made for more than material success or temporary pleasure. Tonight I am inviting you to join me on an extraordinary journey, a pilgrimage that will transport us across centuries and continents to walk alongside the most remarkable person who has ever lived. To witness love in its purest form as it moved through our world in human flesh, touching lives and transforming hearts in ways that continue to ripple through time like stones dropped into still waters that create circles, spreading far beyond the point of initial contact. We will not observe these sacred events from academic distance, like scholars studying ancient texts for historical accuracy, but we will experience them as beloved friends of the one whose name has been drawing seeking hearts for more than 2,000 years. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. The transformation begins as gently as dawn breaking over hills that have witnessed countless sunrises. My beloved companion, as we find ourselves leaving behind the harsh artificial lights and mechanical sounds of your contemporary world, stepping together across the threshold of time into a realm where existence moved in harmony, with rhythms older than human memory, where people understood their place in creation's grand symphony rather than fighting against natural patterns that have governed life since the beginning of time. Feel the ground beneath your feet changing from processed surfaces of modern life to natural textures of earth and stone that have supported human steps for generations beyond counting. Paths worn smooth by sandaled feet of shepherds, leading flocks to green pastures beside still waters. Of merchants carrying goods and stories between distant cities. Of ordinary families making pilgrimages to Jerusalem for festivals that connected them to their ancestors and their faith, in ways that time has not diminished but only deepened with each passing century. The air itself seems to carry different qualities as we breathe together in this ancient landscape, cleaner and warmer than what fills your contemporary lungs, sweetened by herbs and flowers that grow wild across hillsides, where sheep graze under watchful eyes of shepherds who know each animal by name and would risk everything to rescue, even one that wandered away from safety of the flock. Mixed with that natural freshness is the warm scent of bread baking in outdoor ovens, the earthy fragrance of freshly turned soil where farmers plant seeds with prayers on their lips and hope in their hearts for harvests that will feed their families through another season. This is the land of ancient promises and prophetic preparation, where rolling hills stretch toward horizons painted in colors no earthly artist has ever fully captured, where olive groves climb terraced slopes that families have tended for generations, with understanding that their work is partnership with divine providence, cooperation with forces larger and wiser than human planning or individual ambition could ever comprehend. The very stones seem to hold memories of conversations between heaven and earth, prayers offered by faithful people who trusted in God's goodness even when circumstances suggested reasons for doubt or despair. Listen carefully to the sounds filling this sacred landscape, so different from the mechanical noise that surrounds most contemporary existence. Sounds that speak of life lived in conscious dependence upon divine provision and seasonal rhythms that cannot be hurried or controlled through human effort. The gentle bleating of sheep creates pastoral melodies that speak of trust and care, security that comes from knowing you are led by one who loves you more than life itself and would never lead you anywhere that is not for your ultimate good, even when the path seems difficult or the destination unclear. From villages built of stone that came from this very ground comes the rhythmic sound of grain being ground between millstones worn smooth by countless harvests, of water being drawn from wells that have served these communities since their ancestors first settled here, of mothers calling children home as evening settles over hills that have sheltered human families since time beyond memory. These are sounds of life lived close to the earth, in recognition that every blessing comes from hands that created all things and declared them good. Watch the people of this blessed land as they move with different quality than the hurried masses of our modern age. Their steps unhurried because they understand that the most important destinations are not geographical but spiritual. Their eyes clear because they have learned to see beauty in simple things that cost nothing but reveal everything about the character of the one who made them. Their faces are marked by sun and honest labor, but illuminated by something deeper than physical health, something that speaks of souls at peace with their place in creation's order. These are people who have maintained connection to rhythms that govern natural life, who plant according to seasons they did not create, but have learned to trust, who understand their lives as chapters in a larger story being written by wisdom infinitely greater than their own understanding. They work with their hands in ways that connect them directly to creation's materials, finding satisfaction in tasks that produce things genuinely needed by their communities rather than artificial products, designed to create desires that never fully satisfy those who purchase them. Their religious life flows seamlessly through every aspect of daily existence, not compartmentalized into special buildings or designated hours, but woven through the fabric of ordinary moments, like golden thread through simple cloth that becomes beautiful precisely because of that sacred threading. Their prayers rise as naturally as their breathing, their awareness of divine presence as constant as their awareness of sunlight, warming their faces or air filling their lungs, their trust in providential care as fundamental as their confidence in the ground beneath their feet. The synagogues serving as centers of their spiritual community are built of the same materials as their homes, designed for gathering rather than impressing, for learning rather than displaying, for fostering relationship with the divine rather than creating hierarchies among human beings who are all equally loved and equally in need of grace, that none can earn but all can receive through simple faith expressed in daily trust and obedience to commands that are not burdens but pathways to abundant life. Here children learn ancient stories that connect them to their heritage and their destiny. Here adults wrestle with questions that have challenged human hearts since the beginning of thought. Here voices join in songs and prayers that carry both individual longing and collective hope toward heaven with confidence that they are heard and treasured by the one who created the very vocal cords that offer them in worship and supplication and thanksgiving for mercies new every morning. As darkness deepens over this ancient landscape and oil lamps begin to flicker in windows that glow with warm welcome rather than harsh illumination, you can sense anticipation in the very air itself, as if all creation holds its breath in expectation of something unprecedented, about to break into the predictable patterns of human history. The stars appearing one by one in clear desert sky seem brighter and closer than any stars visible from your modern vantage point, and the moon rises with radiance that speaks of purposes beyond mere illumination, of light that carries meaning as well as visibility. This is the world into which we are about to encounter the one whose presence transforms everything it touches, whose words will outlast every empire, and whose love will prove more powerful than death itself. But for now we simply rest in the beauty and peace of the time and place that shaped his human understanding, allowing ourselves to be prepared by its rhythms and its reverence for the kind of encounter that changes hearts and heals souls and restores hope to spirits that had almost forgotten how to believe in the possibility of joy that lasts beyond earthly circumstances. Chapter 3. The Man from Nazareth. In the small hillside village of Nazareth, nestled among the green valleys of Galilee like a precious gem set in a crown of natural beauty, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him. Though to casual observers he appeared remarkably similar to every other Jewish man of his time and region. His name was Jesus, and while his hands showed the honest calluses of years working with wood and stone, while his face bore the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun, and his eyes held the deep earth tones of the soil that had nurtured him, there was something in his gaze that made people pause and look again. Something that spoke of depths beyond human measurement and love beyond human comprehension. He had grown up walking these same winding streets where we find ourselves now in our journey of imagination and faith, playing as a child beneath olive trees whose roots ran deeper than memory, learning his first lessons about life and love and the mysterious ways of divine providence from parents whose faithfulness had already marked them as extraordinary among their neighbors. Joseph, the village carpenter, had taught him that broken things could be mended with patience and skill, that rough materials could be transformed into objects of beauty and usefulness through careful attention and persistent dedication to the work at hand. Mary, his mother, had shown him through her own example what it meant to trust completely in purposes larger than human understanding. To say yes to divine plans even when those plans challenged every conventional expectation and required faith that stretched beyond what seemed reasonable or safe according to worldly wisdom. Her quiet strength and unshakable peace had provided the stable foundation from which Jesus would launch a ministry that would transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history for every generation that would follow. The workshop where Jesus had spent countless hours learning, Joseph's craft was filled with the sounds and scents that would forever remind him of the dignity of honest labor. The satisfaction that comes from creating something useful with one's own hands. The quiet joy of seeing potential realized through the marriage of vision and persistent effort applied with love and attention to detail that honors both the materials and the intended purpose of what is being created. Here among the wood shavings and careful measurements, among the tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen, and the projects that would serve families for decades to come, Jesus absorbed lessons that would later blossom into teachings about building on solid foundations, about trees being known by their fruit, about the patience required for any work that truly matters and will stand the test of time and changing circumstances, that reveal the quality of what was built when conditions were favorable. Even as a young boy, there had been something that distinguished Jesus from his companions in ways that only became clear when people reflected back years later with the gift of hindsight and deeper understanding of who he truly was. The village elders remembered conversations that seemed to carry weight beyond their simple words, questions that penetrated to the heart of matters they had never thought to examine so deeply. Responses that revealed insight far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from someone of his age and limited experience in the ways of the world. When he listened to ancient stories in the synagogue, his attention was so complete and his questions so penetrating that grown men found themselves reconsidering truths they thought they had mastered years before, discovering new depths in familiar passages that had seemed to hold no more secrets after decades of study and reflection. There was something in the way he received instruction that transformed even routine religious education into living encounter with divine truth that breathed and moved and revealed fresh insights to anyone whose heart was open to receive them. The religious leaders of his day would eventually struggle to categorize him. These men who had spent their entire lives memorizing intricate details of scriptural law, but had somehow lost sight of the love that was supposed to flow through every commandment, like life-giving water through parched ground, desperate for refreshment. They inhabited a world where faith had become complicated and burdensome, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed to exclude rather than include, to burden rather than bless, to separate the supposedly worthy from the obviously unworthy, rather than revealing divine love that embraces all humanity without distinction or qualification based on external circumstances. Jesus had grown up observing how ordinary people struggled under weights they were never meant to carry alone, watching how the light in their eyes dimmed when they felt disconnected from the God they longed to know and serve, witnessing how shoulders sagged beneath burdens that religious authorities kept adding rather than lifting according to their original divine purpose. He saw how the simple desire to love God and neighbor had been buried beneath centuries of interpretation and debate, how the joy of spiritual relationship had been replaced by anxiety about ritual correctness, how the freedom that should characterize life with God had been exchanged for nervous striving that could never find rest, because it never found genuine acceptance. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undiminished by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter rather than dimmer when faced with the world's confusion and pain and systematic attempts to obscure divine truth beneath human tradition and institutional self-interest. In Joseph's workshop, he had learned that restoration was always possible, that what seemed ruined could be made beautiful again through the application of skill and patience and love, that refuses to give up on anything or anyone that bears the mark of divine creation. The political atmosphere of his time was thick with tension and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle, creating an environment where hope was dangerous and trust was rare, because those who dared to believe in better possibilities often found themselves crushed beneath systems designed to maintain control rather than promote human flourishing according to divine intention. Roman soldiers marched through Jewish streets with the confident arrogance of occupying forces, their presence a constant reminder that this promised land was currently under foreign control, their demands for taxes and compliance leaving families struggling to maintain both their physical survival and their spiritual integrity. Into this world of political oppression and religious confusion, Jesus would soon step with a message so simple it seemed naive to sophisticated minds, yet so radical it would turn the established order upside down in the most wonderful way possible. He would demonstrate that the kingdom of heaven advances not through violence or political maneuvering, not through religious debate or philosophical argument, but through the revolutionary power of unconditional love expressed in practical service to anyone who needed healing, hope, or simply the assurance that they mattered to someone who would never abandon them regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The morning sun painted the sky in gentle watercolors of rose and gold as Jesus made his way through rocky terrain toward the banks of the Jordan River, where crowds had been gathering for weeks to hear the powerful preaching of a desert prophet whose call to repentance had stirred hearts throughout the region and beyond the borders of Palestine itself. This was John, who had grown up in wilderness places sustained by locusts and wild honey, clothed in rough camel's hair, his entire being radiating the intensity of someone who had spent years learning to distinguish the voice of God from every other sound competing for human attention in a world full of distractions and false promises that lead nowhere but disappointment. John's voice carried across the flowing water with authority that came not from institutional credentials or social position, but from direct encounter with divine truth, calling people to genuine transformation of heart and mind rather than mere external observance of religious customs that had lost their power to change lives or connect souls with the living God who desires relationship more than ritual performance. The crowds that came to him represented every level of Palestinian society, from wealthy merchants to desperate beggars, from learned scribes to simple farmers, all of them sensing that something unprecedented was stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their time. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities found themselves under conviction about choices that had enriched them financially while impoverishing them spiritually and socially, cutting them off from their own people who viewed them as traitors willing to profit from oppression. Their questions to John revealed hearts that had not been completely hardened by years of compromise and moral flexibility, souls that still remembered what it felt like to care about something more than personal gain and safety, achieved through cooperation with systems they knew were unjust. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to God, their weapons temporarily set aside as they contemplated the possibility that there might be different ways to find security and meaning than through the application of force and the cultivation of fear in others who might threaten their interests or challenge their authority. Even these men whose profession required them to think in terms of enemies and threats found something in John's message that spoke to deeper longings for peace and righteousness that violence could never ultimately satisfy. Religious leaders arrived to investigate this new teacher, some with genuinely seeking hearts hungry for authentic spiritual renewal that their institutional religion had failed to provide. Others with suspicious minds already prepared to find fault with anyone whose message challenged their carefully maintained positions of authority and influence within systems that served their personal interests more than they served divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response. The baptism that John offered was far more than ritual washing, but a powerful symbol of death and rebirth, of old life being buried beneath the waters and new life emerging purified and renewed, ready for the kind of transformation that goes far deeper than external behavior, modification to touch the very core of human identity and purpose. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging their need for cleansing they could not provide for themselves, confessing their hunger for righteousness they could not achieve through their own efforts, expressing their readiness to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and ambition. Then one morning that began like so many others that would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, Jesus appeared among the crowd, not as a spectator observing a religious phenomenon from safe distance, but as someone seeking to identify completely with humanity's need for purification and renewal. When John saw him approaching through the gathered multitude, something in the Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was the moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation, the arrival of the one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this historic morning. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive understanding of the reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, roles should be reversed, that he was the one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than the other way around. The baptizer found himself facing the one for whom he'd been preparing the way, the voice crying in wilderness encountering face to face with the Word made flesh, whose presence validated everything. John had been preaching about repentance and preparation for divine intervention in human history. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary to fulfill all righteousness, to complete the picture of his identification with human experience, to demonstrate that he had come not to stand apart from human need, but to enter fully into it, including the process of cleansing and consecration that prepares hearts for divine service and relationship with holy God, who cannot look upon sin, but chooses to look upon his beloved Son, who takes that sin upon himself. As Jesus descended into Jordan's muddy waters, the very atmosphere around the river seemed to shift and change, as if all creation held its breath in recognition that something unprecedented was occurring, something that would mark the beginning of ministry destined to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history through demonstration of divine love that nothing could overcome or diminish. The water that had cleansed countless others now received the one who had no need of cleansing except for this moment of perfect identification with the humanity he had come to save. When Jesus emerged from the water, streaming with river water, but radiant with something far more significant than physical cleansing, the heavens opened in ways that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed in lifetimes spent watching sky and weather. FOR signs and portents. The Spirit of God descended upon him in the form of a dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings, settling upon his head with gentleness that spoke of divine approval and affection beyond human measurement or understanding. Then came the voice, audible to some though not to all, words that revealed the eternal relationship between Father and Son, while announcing to anyone with ears to hear that the long-awaited time had finally arrived, that promises made through centuries of prophetic hope were about to find their fulfillment in this carpenter from Nazareth, who had just submitted to baptism like any other penitent, despite his complete freedom from anything requiring forgiveness. The voice declared with authority that echoed across water and through centuries, and those words would carry hope to every heart that has ever wondered about divine love and acceptance. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, where wildflowers painted the grass in brilliant shades of purple and gold, and the morning air carried the fresh sweetness of water and growing things. Jesus sat down to teach the crowd that had been following him with increasing eagerness as word spread about this rabbi, whose words carried power unlike anything they had ever heard before. The natural amphitheater of the hillside allowed his voice to reach everyone present without strain, while the beautiful setting of lake and mountains created an atmosphere of peace that prepared hearts to receive truths that would challenge everything they thought they knew about God and life and the meaning of human existence. The gathering that morning represented a cross-section of Palestinian society that would have been remarkable in any other context. Wealthy merchants sitting beside poor laborers, learned scribes mixed among illiterate farmers, mothers holding babies next to elderly men whose bent backs spoke of decades of hard work under unforgiving sun. What united them was not social status or educational background, but hunger they all recognized in each other's faces, longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into the silence like seeds into prepared soil, each phrase carrying both immediate comfort and long-term challenge. Each teaching overturning conventional wisdom while revealing deeper truths about the nature of divine love and human purpose that had been hidden from those who thought themselves wise, but revealed to those who approached with hearts like children. He did not speak in the technical language of theological debate or the elaborate rhetoric of political oratory, but in words so simple that children could understand them, yet so profound that the wisest sages would spend lifetimes exploring their depths. He began with declarations that turned the world's understanding of blessing upside down in the most wonderful way imaginable, each pronouncement like lightning illuminating landscape that had been hidden in darkness of conventional thinking about success and failure, worthiness and unworthiness, divine favor and divine judgment. In a culture that equated material prosperity with spiritual blessing and earthly success with heavenly approval, Jesus was revealing that those who recognized their spiritual poverty, their desperate need for something beyond their own resources, were the ones most positioned to receive the infinite wealth of divine love. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he declared, "for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The kingdom belonged to them not despite their emptiness, but because of their readiness to be filled, not despite their acknowledged need, but because of their willingness to receive what they could never earn or achieve through their own efforts or religious performance or moral improvement that always falls short of perfect righteousness required for fellowship with perfectly holy God. He continued with words that washed over the crowd like healing balm on wounds they had been carrying for years without knowing that relief was possible, acknowledging that grief and mourning were not evidence of divine displeasure, but invitation to experience comfort that could only come from the source of all consolation and hope. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Their tears were not wasted water, but precious offerings treasured by the one who catches every tear and remembers every sorrow and promises that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning for those who trust in his goodness. Each blessing he pronounced challenged the assumptions of a world that celebrated strength while dismissing gentleness, that admired aggressive achievement while overlooking humble service, that rewarded those who grabbed what they wanted while ignoring those who waited patiently for blessing to find them through divine providence rather than human manipulation. "Blessed are the meek," he said, transforming gentleness from weakness into strength and humility from failure into the path to true greatness that lasts beyond earthly recognition or reward. The revolutionary nature of his teaching became even more apparent as he moved beyond blessing to practical instruction about living in ways that reflected divine rather than human values, ways that seemed impossible to natural human nature, but became possible through supernatural transformation that divine grace makes available to anyone willing to receive it through faith and surrender to God's perfect will. He referenced legal principles that had governed human relationships for generations, but then introduced radical concepts about not resisting evil persons, about turning the other cheek when struck, about breaking endless cycles of retaliation that kept human communities trapped in patterns of escalating violence. When he commanded love for enemies and prayer for persecutors, the very air seemed to shimmer with the radical possibility he was presenting to anyone willing to consider living according to such extraordinary principles that would require daily dying to self and daily rising to new life, empowered by divine love flowing through human hearts, transformed by grace. This was not merely good advice for those feeling particularly charitable on a given day, but complete redefinition of what it meant to be human, called to embody the same kind of indiscriminate love that caused sun to shine on both righteous and unrighteous. As the day progressed and Jesus continued teaching, using stories drawn from everyday experiences that revealed profound spiritual truths about divine love and human responsibility, the people listening began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of religious instruction. This was not just another teacher offering slightly different interpretations of familiar ideas, but someone who spoke as if he had direct access to the heart of ultimate reality, who revealed truths about God's character and intentions that rang with unmistakable clarity of absolute authenticity. His teachings about prayer transformed what had become for many a duty performed out of obligation into conversation, conducted in confidence of being heard and cherished by Heavenly Father, whose love exceeded any earthly parent's care by infinite measure. The prayer he taught them was both simple enough for children to memorize and profound enough to sustain adult hearts through every joy and sorrow life could present, covering every essential human need from daily provision to eternal forgiveness, from protection against temptation to deliverance from evil that threatens to destroy everything good and beautiful. When Jesus spoke about worry and anxiety, addressing concerns that troubled every heart in his audience, regardless of their economic status or social position, his words carried authority of someone who had never allowed fear to separate him from trust in divine provision that never fails those who seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. He pointed to birds of the air who do not sow or reap or store away in barns, yet are fed by heavenly care, asking if human beings were not much more valuable than they, challenging assumptions about security that drove so much human anxiety and competitive striving. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion as Word of Jesus is Extraordinary. Teaching spread like ripples across the still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of restoration and hope traveled faster than any official messenger could carry news. Something else began happening that amazed everyone who witnessed it firsthand or heard reliable reports from those whose character vouched for the truth of their testimony. The same love and power that flowed through his words began manifesting itself in miraculous healings and supernatural demonstrations of compassion that were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds or validate theological claims, but spontaneous responses to human need that revealed the very heart of God toward every form of suffering and brokenness. In the bustling fishing village of Capernaum, where morning air carried the scent of nets drying in sun and sound of boats being prepared for another day's work on the sea that provided livelihood for families who had learned to read weather and trust their lives to forces beyond their control. A Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying, consumed by fever and paralysis that had resisted every treatment the most skilled physicians could provide with all their accumulated knowledge and experience. This military officer, though representing occupying forces that many Jews considered their enemies and oppressors, had earned genuine respect throughout the community through his fairness and obvious care for Jewish people under his authority, even going so far as to fund construction of their local synagogue with his own resources, because he recognized something valuable in their faith and wanted to support their spiritual life, even though he himself was not part of their covenant. Community. When the centurion heard that Jesus was approaching the town, something in his heart recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of completely different kind than any earthly power he had known in his years of military service under various commanders and in various campaigns that had taught him to recognize genuine authority when he encountered it. His faith was so profound and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear that he sent word to Jesus saying there was no need for him to actually visit the house where the servant lay dying. "Just say the word," he insisted through his messengers, "and my servant will be healed." He understood something about divine authority that escaped many who had been raised in traditions of faith, recognizing that Jesus' power was not limited by physical presence or geographical distance, but operated according to principles that transcended ordinary human experience and natural limitations that govern how most healing and help must be delivered through direct contact and physical intervention. The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel, among people who should have been most prepared to recognize and receive divine intervention in human affairs. The man understood something about the nature of divine power that many religious people missed completely, recognizing that true authority needs no props or rituals or elaborate ceremonies, but accomplishes its purposes through simple words spoken with confidence in divine power that backs up every promise. And indeed, at the very moment Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, the centurion's servant opened his eyes, sat up in his bed, and asked for something to eat, his fever completely gone and his strength fully restored as if he had never been ill at all. The healing was instantaneous, complete, and undeniable, witnessed by household members who had been preparing for death but instead found themselves celebrating restoration that defied every expectation and challenged every assumption about how divine power operates in human situations. On another day, as Jesus was teaching beside the shore where fishing boats bobbed gently in shallow water and children played in sand while their mothers listened to his words with hearts hungry for hope and wisdom that could make sense of their daily struggles, a woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 long years pressed through the crowd that surrounded him like protective barrier between ordinary people and extraordinary teacher whose presence drew both seekers and skeptics. She had spent everything she owned on physicians who had only made her condition worse through treatments that promised much but delivered little, except additional pain and expense that left her not only physically weakened, but financially devastated. According to religious laws of her culture, her ailment made her ceremonially unclean, cutting her off from normal social interaction and preventing her from participating in worship and community, life that gave meaning and structure to existence for people of her faith and background. She had lived for over a decade as exile in her own town, watching life go by from margins where shame and physical suffering had relegated her, growing weaker physically while her hope gradually dwindled to faintest flicker that threatened to extinguish itself, completely underweight of repeated disappointments and failed treatments that had consumed her savings without providing relief. But she had heard about Jesus, about his compassion for outcasts and sinners, about his willingness to touch the untouchable and welcome the unwelcome, about the way he seemed to see past external circumstances to hearts that beat beneath with hopes and dreams that suffering had not entirely destroyed. Her faith was desperate but certain, born from kind of hope that emerges only when every other option has been exhausted, yet something in the soul refuses to surrender completely to despair that would end all seeking and all believing in possibilities beyond present circumstances. "If I can just touch the edge of his cloak," she whispered to herself as she pushed through the crowd with determination, fueled by years of longing for freedom from condition that had stolen her dignity along with her health. "I know I will be healed." When her trembling fingers barely grazed the hem of his garment as he passed by, power flowed from Jesus like lightning illuminating darkness, and immediately she felt the bleeding stop. Felt strength returning to body that had been drained by years of illness. Felt shame and isolation that had defined her existence lifted away like burdens she had carried. So long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight and look people in the eye without fear of rejection or disgust. Jesus, sensing that healing power had gone out from him like river flowing toward thirsty ground, stopped walking and turned to crowd with question, born not of irritation but of desire to complete what had begun with physical healing, by adding blessing of personal recognition and restored dignity that would matter as much as bodily restoration. "Who touched me?" he asked gently, his question revealing heart that cared not only about miracles, but about people who received them. Not only about demonstrations of power, but about relationships that power was meant to restore. When the woman came forward, terrified yet compelled by kindness in his voice, expecting rebuke for her presumption, but receiving instead words that transformed her understanding of her own worth and place in community of faith. Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness and spoke recognition that welcomed her back into human family, from which disease and religious law had exiled her for far too long. "Daughter," he said, and in that single word she was no longer outcast or unclean woman or social pariah, but daughter welcomed home after long absence, family member whose place at table had been kept waiting for her return. Beloved child whose worth had never been diminished in eyes of heavenly Father despite what earthly circumstances had seemed to suggest about her value and acceptability to those who should have shown her compassion. "Your faith has healed you," Jesus continued, attributing the miracle not to his power alone, but to trust she had demonstrated in approaching him despite every social and religious barrier that should have kept her away. Faith that had reached across gulf of separation to touch hem of one who had come specifically to heal broken-hearted and bind up wounded spirits wherever they might be found. "Go in peace and be freed from your suffering," he added, sending her away not just physically healed but spiritually restored to fullness of life and relationship that her condition had stolen. The miracles multiplied day after day, each one revealing not just divine power but divine heart that could not remain unmoved by human suffering in any form it took. Power that expressed itself not in spectacular displays, designed to impress observers, but in quiet acts of restoration that returned dignity along with health, hope along with healing, relationships along with relief from physical ailments that had isolated people from communities they needed for emotional and spiritual survival. Lepers whose disease had made them living symbols of decay and death found their flesh restored to purity of childhood, their skin glowing with health they had not known in years, their voices freed to speak words of gratitude after years of having to cry warnings to keep others away from contamination their presence represented. Blind beggars who had spent their lives in darkness suddenly discovered world of color and light and beauty that exceeded their most wonderful dreams, while deaf ears were open to receive full symphony of creation's song that had been playing around them unheard. Chapter 7. Walking among the people, what distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time was not merely the power of his teachings or the wonder of his miracles, though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed or could explain through natural means. The truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was the way he moved through the world, the people he chose to spend time with, and the barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by the casual way he dismantled centuries of social convention and religious tradition simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth in eyes of divine love. In bustling marketplaces of Galilee, where merchants called out their wares under colorful awnings and air filled with sounds of bargaining and conversation, where children darted between stalls and women carried water jars with practiced grace developed through years of daily necessity, Jesus walked with relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people living ordinary lives. Unlike religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity or social standing, Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy company of tax collectors and fishermen, former prostitutes and reformed sinners, anyone whose heart remained open to possibility of transformation through divine love freely offered. He would pause at Potter's workshop, examining vessels taking shape under skilled hands and asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in craft while using answers as natural illustrations for deeper truths about divine potter who shapes human hearts with infinite patience and wisdom, never discarding clay that seems flawed, but working patiently until it becomes something beautiful and useful for purposes that honor both Creator and creation. At Baker's stall, he would breathe in warm fragrance of fresh bread and speak about spiritual nourishment that could satisfy hungers no earthly food could touch, his words transforming everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities that gave meaning to temporal activities and revealed divine care expressed through provision of daily needs that people often took for granted until scarcity reminded them of their dependence. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus, sensing in him kind of adult who would listen to their questions without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, who would take seriously their concerns and dreams and fears in ways that made them feel valued and heard rather than dismissed as interruptions to more important adult business. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission, Jesus' response revealed heart of his entire ministry and mission. "Let little children come to me," he said, his voice carrying authority that stopped disciples in their tracks and made them reconsider their understanding of what was truly important in Kingdom of Heaven, "and do not hinder them. For Kingdom of Heaven belongs to such as these." In their unguarded trust, their capacity for wonder, their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met, Jesus found perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation or calculation. He would sit on ground with them, his teaching robes gathering dust as he listened to their excited chatter about treasures they had found or adventures they had imagined, entering into their world with such genuine delight that they forgot he was anyone other than friend who cared about what mattered to them. Their simplicity and trust became lessons for adults who had learned to complicate faith with requirements and conditions that obscured rather than revealed the generous heart of God toward all his children. When Samaritan woman approached Jacob's well during noon heat, timing her visit to avoid other women who normally gathered there in cooler morning hours, She expected to draw her water in solitude and return home without encountering anyone who might remind her of shame and disappointment that had marked her recent years with series of failed relationships that had left her isolated even among people who were themselves outcasts from Jewish perspective. The last thing she anticipated was finding Jewish rabbi sitting beside well, and she certainly never imagined that he would speak to her, let alone ask her for a drink of water, in violation of every social convention governing interactions between Jews and Samaritans, men and women, religious teachers and social outcasts, whose very presence was considered contaminating by those who prided themselves on ritual purity and moral superiority. The conversation that unfolded revealed both Jesus' supernatural knowledge of her personal history and his profound compassion for loneliness and searching that had driven her from one relationship to another in futile attempt to find someone who could satisfy deep thirst of her heart for love that would never disappoint or abandon her when difficulties arose or novelty wore off and human limitations became apparent. Instead of condemnation she expected from religious teacher, he offered her living water, kind that would spring up from within her own soul and become source of satisfaction that no earthly relationship could provide or destroy. Eternal spring that would never run dry regardless of circumstances or human failures that had taught her not to expect permanence or faithfulness from anyone who claimed to care about her welfare and happiness. By the time their conversation ended, this woman who had come to well burdened with secrets and sorrow left her water jar behind and ran back to very town, where she had been living as something of outcast, so excited about her encounter with Jesus that she could not contain news that had to be shared with anyone willing to listen to testimony of someone whose life had been transformed by meeting one who knew everything about her but chose to offer grace instead of judgment. "Come and see man who told me everything I ever did," she announced to people she had been avoiding. Could this be the Christ we have been waiting for? Her transformation was so evident, her joy so authentic and contagious, that many Samaritans came to believe in Jesus simply because of her testimony, proving that divine love recognizes no boundaries of ethnicity or gender or social standing that humans use to divide themselves from one another and from God who created all people in his image. Chapter 8. Fellow seekers of peace, as we pause here together in our sacred journey through the life and love of Jesus Christ. My dearest companion on this path of peace that we have been walking side by side, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful and profound that has been happening in the quiet chambers of your heart as we have breath together. The same holy air that surrounded Jesus as he moved among the people of his time. As we have witnessed together the same revolutionary love in action that continues to transform hearts in our own day, including yours as you rest here in the gentle embrace of this peaceful evening that has become sanctuary for your weary soul. You are not alone in this experience of encountering divine love through these timeless narratives that speak to every generation with fresh power and relevance that transcends cultural boundaries and historical distances. All around our world tonight, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to this same place of refuge. Other weary hearts seeking the same comfort you are discovering. Other searching spirits drawn by the same longing for peace that brought you to this quiet space, where modern urgency gives way to ancient wisdom and contemporary anxiety dissolves in presence of eternal love that knows your name and understands your deepest needs. There is something profoundly moving about this invisible community of seekers that has formed around these sacred stories, this fellowship of hearts that spans continents and cultures, united not by geography or background, but by shared recognition that our souls were made for more than endless cycle of stress and striving that characterizes so much of modern existence. Some who join us tonight are longtime pilgrims who have discovered that these quiet encounters with Jesus bring special quality of rest that cannot be found anywhere. else in our hurried world where peace has become luxury rather than necessity for human flourishing. Others are newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before as irrelevant to practical concerns of daily life. Drawn by hungers they can barely name but cannot ignore, pulled by longings that have grown stronger with each passing year that has taught them earthly pleasures alone cannot satisfy the God-shaped emptiness within every human heart created for relationship with its Creator. Whether you have been walking this contemplative path for years, or whether tonight marks your first tentative step into this realm of sacred rest, you belong here completely, exactly as you are, with all your questions and doubts intact, with all your hopes and fears acknowledged as natural parts of human experience that need not be resolved before you can receive love that accepts you unconditionally. Your past mistakes are already forgiven. Your future possibilities are already embraced by grace that sees not what you have been, but what you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently in depths of your being. If these stories of Jesus' compassion have stirred something beautiful in your spirit tonight, if his interactions with outcasts and sinners have awakened hope in places of your heart that had grown accustomed to disappointment, if his gentle treatment of children and his patient love for confused disciples has helped you believe that you too might be worthy of such tender acceptance despite everything that whispers otherwise, then I want to invite you to consider becoming part of our growing family of fellow seekers who have discovered that spiritual rest is not luxury but necessity for souls created for communion with divine love. By subscribing to our journey together, you are not merely accessing additional content, though there will certainly be more sacred stories to explore, more ancient wisdom to discover, more pathways to kind of peace that restores weary hearts and heals wounded spirits that have been battered by experiences the world offers as normal, but which your soul knows were never meant to define human existence or limit human possibilities for joy and meaning and connection with eternal purposes. You are joining a community of people who understand that slowing down is actually speeding up toward what matters most. That choosing contemplation over constant activity is choosing wisdom over foolishness that masquerades as productivity but produces only exhaustion and emptiness. That some truths can only be received when we create space for them to settle into hearts that have learned to be still in presence of divine love that never grows impatient with our slowness to understand or our tendency to forget what we have learned. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend, because every heart that opens to divine love creates ripples that bless not only that individual life, but lives of everyone whose path intersects with someone who has been touched by grace and carries that touch forward into daily interactions that become opportunities for love to multiply and spread through human connections that reveal divine care working through ordinary people transformed by extraordinary encounter with Christ. Please know that your thoughts and reflections, your own experiences of encountering Jesus through these stories, are deeply valued and welcomed in conversation we maintain through comments and connections that form when people risk vulnerability and share honestly about their spiritual journeys with others who understand from personal experience what it means to search for something beyond what visible world can provide to souls that know they were made for more than material success or temporary pleasure. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort and challenge, both peace and purpose, both rest and renewal that empowers service to others who need what you have received through your own encounter with love that never fails or abandons those who turn to it in their times of greatest need and deepest longing for connection with something larger than themselves. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment, And sharing those struggles gives others permission to acknowledge their own need for kind of grace that makes all things new, and hope that anchors souls through every storm that threatens to overwhelm faith with fear or cynicism that poses as wisdom, but actually represents surrender to despair that God never intended for his beloved children to accept as final word about their lives or their possibilities. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered God in desert silences and mountain solitudes, learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges that sometimes seem overwhelming but are never beyond reach of grace that specializes in impossible situations. Chapter 9. The 12 and Their Stories, as our contemplative journey continues through the sacred landscape of Jesus' ministry. My beloved child, let us draw closer to observe the extraordinary transformation occurring in the lives of 12 ordinary men who accepted an invitation that would change not only their own destinies, but the course of human history itself. These disciples, chosen not for religious credentials or spiritual maturity, but for willingness to follow wherever love might lead them, became living demonstrations of what divine grace can accomplish in hearts open to being shaped and molded by perfect love and infinite patience, working through daily relationship with one who sees potential where others see only problems and limitations. Feel yourself joining that inner circle gathered around Jesus as evening settles over the hills of Galilee, oil lamps casting dancing shadows on faces that have been forever marked by encounter with someone who saw not what they were, but what they could become through transforming power of grace, working persistently through seasons of growth and failure and renewed commitment to path requiring more courage and faith than any of them initially understood when they first responded to simple invitation to follow wherever he might lead them. There is Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter, whose impulsive nature and fierce loyalty made him both most devoted and most disappointing of disciples. Man whose capacity for bold faith was matched only by tendency toward spectacular failure that revealed how completely divine love could transform even most unstable personalities into pillars of strength, supporting others in their own times of testing and weakness. His weathered hands spoke of years spent hauling nets from churning waters of Galilee, but his eyes revealed hunger for something beyond predictable rhythms of fishing and family that had defined his life until moment when carpenter turned teacher spoke invitation that penetrated straight to his restless heart. Peter possessed kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than careful reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of divine grace sufficient for whatever challenges love placed before him. Watch him struggle with contradiction between deep love for Jesus and very human fear of suffering that following him might require, desire to be brave warring with instinct for self-preservation that would lead him through valleys of denial and shame before emerging into sunlight of forgiveness that restored him completely. Beside him sits Andrew, Peter's brother, quieter soul whose gift lay not in dramatic gestures or passionate speeches, but in steady work of bringing others to Jesus, recognizing treasure in unlikely people and connecting them with source of all blessing and hope and transformation that human hearts desperately need but often don't know how to find without help from those who have already discovered what they're seeking. He was among first to recognize who Jesus was, and his immediate instinct upon making this discovery was to find Peter and introduce him to teacher who had captured his heart and changed his understanding of what it means to know God personally. Throughout their journey together, Andrew remained one who noticed individuals when others saw only crowds, who recognized potential when others saw only problems, who understood that kingdom of God often advances through personal introductions rather than public proclamations, through one-on-one conversations rather than mass rallies that capture attention, but don't necessarily change hearts in lasting ways that survive testing and opposition from world that prefers darkness to light. James and John, sons of Zebedee, carried nickname Sons of Thunder because of passionate temperaments and readiness to call down divine judgment on those who opposed their master or rejected his message, burning with kind of righteous indignation that wanted to protect Jesus from criticism and rejection that seemed incomprehensible to hearts that had experienced his love and witnessed his power over forces that oppressed and destroyed human happiness and hope. Their mother's ambitious request that they be granted highest positions in Jesus' kingdom revealed family dynamic where love and political calculation sometimes became uncomfortably intertwined, where spiritual calling got mixed with very human desires for recognition and status that competed with pure motives of service and sacrifice that should characterize those who claim to follow one who came not to be served, but to serve others regardless of whether such service brings recognition or reward from human observers who may not understand true greatness. Watch as Jesus patiently teaches these brothers that greatness in his kingdom is measured not by positions they hold or authority they wield over others, but by service they render in love. They demonstrate to those who need what they have ability to provide, through gifts and resources entrusted to them by divine providence. True leadership comes not from dominating others, but from washing their feet, from becoming servant of all rather than master over any, from using whatever power or influence they possess to lift others up rather than to elevate themselves above those they should be helping and encouraging. The transformation of John from son of thunder into apostle of love demonstrates miraculous power of divine grace to redirect even most self-serving impulses into instruments of healing and hope, most aggressive tendencies into gentle ministrations that comfort broken hearts and encourage struggling souls who need to experience God's love through human representatives who have learned to love as they have been loved by one who loves perfectly and unconditionally without regard for human worthiness or performance. Philip brings practical, analytical mind to group, kind of person who wants to understand how things work before committing to them completely, who likes to have plans and budgets and logical explanations for what they're being asked to do or believe. When Jesus tests him by asking how they might feed crowd of 5,000 hungry people, Philip immediately begins calculating costs and logistics, his systematic mind missing opportunity to exercise faith in one who specializes in making much from little, who delights in confounding human wisdom with divine solutions no amount of planning or preparation could anticipate. Yet his honest questions and straightforward personality make him approachable to those who seek Jesus but feel intimidated by more dramatic personalities among disciples, those who need someone to translate spiritual truths into practical terms they can understand and apply to everyday lives filled with ordinary challenges requiring extraordinary faith to navigate successfully while maintaining hope and joy that don't depend on circumstances being favorable. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with skepticism of someone whose knowledge of geography and prophecy made him doubt that anything significant could emerge from village as insignificant as Nazareth. His honest questions revealed not cynicism but genuine desire to understand truth, not rejection of divine revelation, but careful evaluation of claims that seemed too wonderful to believe without adequate evidence that could satisfy both heart and mind, seeking authentic encounter with living God. When Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, describing him as true Israelite in whom there was no deceit, Nathanael's skepticism dissolved into worship that was all more profound because it had been preceded by honest doubt rather than uncritical acceptance of extraordinary claims that required faith to embrace fully. His transformation from skeptic to believer became pattern for many who would encounter Jesus. Through honest questioning that leads to genuine faith rather than superficial acceptance that crumbles under pressure. Chapter 10. Opposition and persecution. As Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine and his message of radical love reached deeper into hearts that had been hardened by disappointment and religious legalism that promised much but delivered little genuine transformation. The established authorities began to recognize him not as welcome spiritual teacher, but as fundamental threat to carefully constructed systems through which they maintained their power, their prestige, and their comfortable arrangements with both religious tradition and political reality that served their interests more than divine purposes or human needs crying out for compassionate response. Feel atmosphere beginning to change as opposition crystallized, not from crowds of ordinary people who continued flocking to him for healing and hope that human institutions could not provide, but from those whose authority and comfortable assumptions were threatened by radical nature of his teachings and undeniable power accompanying his words that made their own religious performances seem empty and lifeless by comparison with authentic spiritual authority they could neither match nor explain. A way through conventional interpretations. Religious leaders who had spent entire lives studying scriptures and maintaining positions as interpreters of God's will found themselves facing carpenter from Nazareth who spoke with authority they could not match, who performed miracles they could not explain through natural means, who drew crowds they could not control, and who taught with freshness and relevance that made their own careful expositions seem dry and academic rather than life-giving and transformational in ways hungry hearts desperately needed and craved. Pharisees who had built entire identity around meticulous observance of law and careful attention to religious detail that set them apart from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined and knowledgeable. Watched in growing dismay as Jesus seemed to treat their most sacred traditions as human additions rather than divine requirements, as obstacles to genuine relationship with God rather than pathways to spiritual growth and maturity. They had devoted their lives to mastering and teaching to others who looked to them for guidance. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions, but expressions of genuine concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom that had preserved their people through centuries of testing and persecution. They had spent their lives learning to navigate complex requirements of religious law, creating elaborate systems designed to help people avoid accidentally breaking divine commandments, building careful fences around biblical precepts to ensure no one could inadvertently step outside boundaries of acceptable behavior. Jesus' responses to their criticisms revealed heart issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride, how quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation, how subtly desire to serve God could be corrupted into desire to be recognized as especially godly by others, whose approval had become more important than divine approval that comes to those who love God with whole heart and demonstrate that love through practical service to others who need what they have ability to provide. When he told them that Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, he was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values that should govern how people relate to God and to one another in communities of faith. His question about whether it was lawful on Sabbath to do good or evil, to save life or kill, cut through religious technicalities to expose heart of what God truly desires from his people who claim to love him. The Sadducees, who controlled temple and its lucrative operations while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities, saw Jesus' threat to delicate balance they had achieved between religious autonomy and imperial oversight that allowed them to maintain positions of power and influence. They didn't share Pharisees' concern about ceremonial purity or detailed law observance, but they were deeply worried about anyone whose growing popularity might attract unwanted attention from Roman governors who had little patience for Jewish religious movements that could be interpreted as politically subversive. Their opposition to Jesus was primarily practical rather than theological, motivated more by concern for institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreement with his teachings or methods. They understood that Roman rule depended on local cooperation, and that any disruption in peaceful administration of their territory could result in harsh crackdowns that would destroy their privileged position and potentially bring disaster to entire nation already suffering under foreign occupation. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on their expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support his positions, as was customary among rabbis who built their teachings on foundations laid by previous generations of scholars and interpreters. Jesus didn't need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate his teachings, because he spoke with immediacy of personal knowledge, revealing divine truth with clarity that made their elaborate scholarly debates seem irrelevant and their careful academic distinctions appear insignificant compared to transforming power of simple truth spoken with authority that came from perfect relationship with Heavenly Father, whose will he knew intimately. Their professional identity was built on being recognized experts in matters of religious law and spiritual interpretation, ones to whom ordinary people looked for guidance about proper belief and acceptable behavior that would please God and secure his blessing. Jesus' ability to teach profound truths in simple language that connected directly with human hearts bypassed their mediating function, making their specialized knowledge seem unnecessary and their authority appear questionable in ways that threatened both their livelihood and their sense of purpose and meaning. The opposition intensified as religious leaders began testing Jesus with carefully crafted questions, designed to trap him in contradictions or force him to make statements that could be used against him either in religious courts or before Roman tribunals that had power to impose severe penalties, including death for those found guilty of sedition or blasphemy. They asked about paying taxes to Caesar, hoping to make him choose between alienating Jewish patriots who resented foreign taxation and giving them grounds to accuse him of encouraging rebellion against imperial authority. Chapter 11. The final journey to Jerusalem. The time had come for Jesus to set his face steadfastly toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense the shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to the holy city where prophets had always come to die, and where the ultimate demonstration of divine love would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice for the sake of human redemption that would cost him everything but gain salvation for everyone who would believe in his name and trust in his finished work. The relaxed pace of his Galilean ministry was drawing to a close as he gathered his disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation, everything they had imagined about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, everything they had expected about triumph and victory achieved through means the world would recognize and celebrate rather than through apparent defeat that would actually represent ultimate victory over sin and death and separation from God. His closest followers recognized that something had changed in their master's attitude and approach. Though they struggled to understand nature of transformation they were witnessing as he moved with increased intensity and purposefulness toward destination they knew was dangerous, but which he seemed determined to reach despite obvious threats that awaited him there. There was new depth in his prayers, deeper urgency in his teaching, quality of focused determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem, despite every earthly reason to avoid city, where religious and political authorities had already made their hostility clear. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness, their excitement about accompanying their master to Holy City during Passover season mixed with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them all in terms of safety and security they had found in relatively peaceful ministry among villages and towns of Galilee, where people generally received them with openness and gratitude rather than suspicion and hostility. They might encounter in Jerusalem where opposition was more organized and politically connected. Some walked close behind Jesus, trying to catch fragments of his prayers as he communed with his Father about mission that was reaching its climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into one terrible experience of separation from divine love that he would endure voluntarily for sake of those who deserved judgment, but would receive mercy through his substitutionary sacrifice. Their hearts were troubled by words they occasionally overheard about suffering and death that made no sense in context of kingdom they had been expecting him to establish through demonstrations of irresistible power. Others hung back in group, whispering among themselves about wisdom of this journey, wondering whether following Jesus to Jerusalem might be final mistake that would cost them everything they held dear, including their lives and futures and families, who depended on them for support and protection in a world where being associated with condemned criminal could bring persecution and suffering upon everyone connected to his movement and message that challenged established authorities. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond its borders, some seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones, others simply curious about man who had become subject of so much discussion and debate among religious leaders and common people alike who were trying to understand what his teachings meant and whether his claims about divine authority could possibly be true. Many joined growing procession, sensing that they were witnessing something historic, participating in events that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come by those whose lives had been touched by encounter with love, incarnate walking among humanity in human form. Among those who joined their journey were people whose lives had been transformed by Jesus' ministry over previous years, former outcasts who had been welcomed into his fellowship, healed individuals whose restoration had become permanent testimony to divine power working through human weakness. But there were also those who followed with darker intentions, agents sent by religious authorities to monitor Jesus' activities and report back on his movements, Roman officials concerned about any gathering that might become politically disruptive, curiosity seekers whose interest was more entertainment than transformation, all creating atmosphere of tension, even in midst of celebration, as different groups with competing purposes and conflicting expectations traveled together toward city, where everything would be decided. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before, providing place of refuge and authentic fellowship that offered respite from demands of public ministry, that never allowed complete privacy or total relaxation from responsibilities that weighed heavily on his human heart, even as his divine nature remained perfectly at peace with Father's will. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead stage for most dramatic miracle of his entire earthly ministry. raising of Lazarus from dead after 4 days in tomb. Demonstration of power over death itself that would send shockwaves throughout region and provide final evidence of his divine nature that would either convince honest seekers or harden opposition of those whose hearts had already been closed to truth. No amount of evidence could penetrate. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, he found household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving loss of their beloved brother and wondering why Jesus had not come sooner, why he had allowed someone he loved to die when his presence could have prevented such tragedy that had plunged their family into sorrow and their community into sympathy for loss that seemed so unnecessary and premature. Their questions revealed kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes that characterizes authentic faith. Struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering, how divine power can permit losses that seem preventable and unnecessary, to human understanding that cannot see larger picture or comprehend ways that even death serves purposes of love that transcends earthly life and temporal relationships that matter deeply but are not final word about meaning and purpose and eternal significance of human existence. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal in the profound stillness that settles over sacred moments when eternity intersects with time. My beloved child, feel yourself entering with reverent heart the upper room in Jerusalem, where atmosphere is heavy with anticipation and sorrow. Joy and grief intermingled like wine and tears in same cup that Jesus will soon offer to his disciples as symbol of new covenant being established through his blood, poured out for many for forgiveness of sins that separate humanity from holy God, who cannot look upon iniquity but chooses to look upon his beloved Son, bearing that iniquity in place of those who deserve judgment but receive mercy instead. The evening shadows lengthen as 13 men recline around low table, sharing what they all sense will be final meal together before everything changes forever. Though only Jesus fully comprehends magnitude of what is about to unfold and cost of love that will be demonstrated through sacrifice, beyond human ability to understand or appreciate without divine revelation, illuminating its significance for every human soul that has ever lived or ever will live upon this earth that groans under weight of sin and death and separation from its Creator. Disciples sense something momentous is approaching, but their understanding is still clouded by continued expectation that Jesus might yet reveal himself as political Messiah they have been hoping for, that this Passover celebration in Jerusalem might be moment when he finally claims his throne and establishes earthly kingdom they have been anticipating throughout years of following him and learning from him and witnessing his power over disease and death and forces of nature that obey his voice. Without question or delay, the room itself is simple and humble, furnished with basic necessities for Passover observance, but containing none of luxury that might befit what disciples imagine should be celebration of their Master's approaching coronation as King of Israel, who will drive out Roman oppressors and restore glory days their people remember from stories of great kings who ruled when God's blessing rested visibly upon their nation, and enemies trembled before might of armies fighting. Under divine protection and guidance, oil lamps cast dancing shadows on whitewashed walls, creating atmosphere of intimacy that draws 13 men together around table, where bread and wine await blessing that will transform this ordinary meal into most significant dinner in human history, institution of sacrament that will be remembered and repeated by believers throughout world for thousands of years to come as memorial of love poured out completely for redemption of lost humanity, wandering in darkness without hope of finding way home to God. Jesus rises from his place at table and does something that shocks his disciples into stunned silence and uncomfortable confusion that reveals how little they understand about nature of kingdom he has come to establish and kind of leadership He intends to model for them and for everyone who would claim to follow him in path of service rather than domination, love rather than power, sacrifice rather than self-advancement that characterizes kingdoms of this world. He removes his outer garment, wraps towel around his waist, and begins to wash their feet like lowliest servant in household, performing menial task none of them had volunteered to do, accepting role their pride had prevented them from undertaking because they were still thinking about greatness in terms world understands rather than terms heaven values and God rewards with approval that matters more than human recognition or earthly status that passes away like morning mist. The sounds in room become muted and awkward as reality of what is happening penetrates their consciousness. Gentle splash of water in basin, soft rustle of towel, quiet intake of breath as each disciple realizes his master is kneeling before him to perform work that even household slaves often tried to avoid, because it placed them in position of serving those they considered beneath them in social hierarchy that Jesus is. Deliberately overturning through demonstration of love that serves, regardless of status or position or conventional expectations about who should serve whom in relationships between teachers and students, masters and disciples, leaders and followers who are all equally loved by Heavenly Father. Peter's protest reveals deep offense that divine humility causes to human pride and conventional thinking about authority and leadership that assumes those with power should be served by those without power rather than using their power to serve others who need what they have ability to provide through gifts and resources entrusted to them by divine providence. Lord, are you going to wash my feet? He asks, his question carrying undertones of shock and embarrassment at witnessing teacher perform work of servant, confusion that comes when divine love operates according to principles contradicting everything world teaches about power and position. But Jesus' response cuts through Peter's objection to reveal deeper significance of what is happening, spiritual truth being enacted through physical demonstration of service and humility that points beyond itself to greater cleansing that his death will accomplish for everyone who believes in him and receives gift of salvation purchased through his perfect sacrifice on cross. Unless I wash you, you have no part with me, he explains, transforming foot washing from simple object lesson into profound symbol of spiritual cleansing that comes not through human effort, but through divine grace. Feel profound symbolism contained in this simple act of service. Way it demonstrates character of kingdom Jesus has come to establish, where greatest is servant of all, and leadership means washing feet of those who follow rather than demanding they acknowledge your superiority through gestures of submission and recognition that elevate some above others in hierarchies that may impress humans but mean nothing to God, who judges hearts rather than external appearances or achievements that pass away like flowers of field. When washing is complete and Jesus has returned to his place at table, he begins speaking words that will be treasured and pondered by every generation of believers until he comes again to establish fully the kingdom he is now inaugurating through his life and approaching death and resurrection that will validate every claim he has made about his identity and mission and relationship with Father who sent him to seek and save lost sheep of house of Israel. As they share Passover meal with its traditional elements and familiar prayers, connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, Jesus takes unleavened bread that commemorates their forefathers' hasty departure from bondage and invests it with meaning that will echo through eternity as symbol of his body given for redemption of humanity, enslaved to sin and death and separation from God, who created them for fellowship with himself. Take and eat, he says, breaking bread and distributing it among disciples who receive these familiar elements with growing awareness that something unprecedented is happening. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Simple act of sharing food becomes profound symbol of divine love poured out completely for human salvation, transforming ordinary meal into sacred covenant that will bind believers to their Savior and to one another across centuries and cultures. Similarly, cup of wine that traditionally represented joy and divine blessing becomes symbol of new covenant, sealed not with blood of sacrificial animals, but with Jesus' own life poured out for forgiveness of sins that separate human hearts from holy God, who desires relationship, but cannot compromise his perfect righteousness by ignoring rebellion that must be dealt with according to divine justice, tempered by infinite mercy expressed through substitutionary sacrifice. This cup is new covenant in my blood, he tells them as they share wine that will forever after remind his followers of price paid for their redemption, which is poured out for you and for many for forgiveness of sins. The disciples receive these elements with reverence, though they cannot yet grasp full significance of what Jesus is telling them, cannot comprehend that they are participating in inauguration of relationship between God and humanity that will last forever. But then atmosphere in room shifts dramatically as Jesus makes announcement that sends shock waves through their intimate fellowship, words that fall like stones into peaceful gathering and create ripples of confusion and distress that reach every heart around table, where love had been celebrated and covenant established. One of you will betray me, he declares, and they begin asking one by one whether surely he doesn't mean them, their voices revealing genuine bewilderment at possibility that anyone among their number could be capable of such treachery against one who had loved them so completely. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From peaceful intimacy of upper room, where love had been demonstrated through service and covenant had been established through shared bread and wine, my precious child, we find ourselves following Jesus through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with his Father, but which tonight would become arena for most intense spiritual battle ever fought on earth, struggle between divine will and human nature, between love's determination to save and natural recoil from suffering required to accomplish such salvation. The garden that had been sanctuary of peace during their previous visits feels different this night. Charged with atmosphere of impending crisis that even disciples can sense despite their incomplete understanding of what is approaching with each passing hour that brings them closer to events that will test every assumption they have made about divine power and human expectations, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes that often operate according to principles that contradict worldly wisdom and conventional thinking about victory and defeat. Jesus tells Peter, James, and John that his soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death, asking them to stay and keep watch with him while he withdraws further into garden to wrestle alone with cup Father has prepared for him to drink. His words reveal profound humanity of one who is fully divine, showing that incarnation meant experiencing complete range of human emotion, including anguish so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength, revealing that salvation would be accomplished not through divine power that bypassed human suffering, but through divine love that entered fully into human experience. Moving beyond even these closest companions, Jesus falls face down on ground in prayer that reveals ultimate submission of divine will to divine purpose, perfect harmony between Father and Son that was willing to embrace even separation for sake of human redemption. That could be accomplished no other way than through perfect sacrifice offered by one who knew no sin, but became sin for us so that we might become righteousness of God in him. My Father, he prays with voice breaking under weight of what lies ahead. If it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. The cup he references is not merely physical death, but spiritual agony of bearing humanity's sin, experiencing separation from divine love that sin creates. drinking full measure of divine wrath against human rebellion while maintaining perfect love for those whose rebellion he was taking upon himself voluntarily. Yet his prayer concludes with words that secure salvation of everyone who will ever believe in him as substitute for their sins and source of their righteousness before God, who accepts Christ's perfect obedience in place of our disobedience, his perfect love in place of our selfishness, his perfect sacrifice in place of our deserved punishment. Not as I will, but as you will, he surrenders. And in those words, eternal destiny of humanity is determined by divine love, choosing sacrifice over self-preservation. 3 times he prays this prayer of ultimate surrender, and 3 times he returns to find his disciples sleeping, unable to keep watch with him during his hour of greatest need. Their failure revealing human inability to comprehend or participate in depth of what divine love was willing to endure for their salvation. His gentle rebuke reveals not anger, but loneliness that makes suffering even more profound. Isolation that comes when those we love most cannot stay present with us in our darkest moments of testing. As Jesus emerges from his final time of prayer, strengthened by angelic ministry, but confirmed in his commitment to drink cup his Father had prepared for him, sound of approaching footsteps and flickering torches breaks garden's sacred silence with harsh reality of betrayal and violence that will demonstrate how far human hatred will go to silence voice of love and eliminate threat that divine truth poses to systems built on lies and maintained through force rather than justice. Judas arrives leading crowd of soldiers and temple guards armed with swords and clubs as if they were arresting dangerous criminal rather than teacher whose only weapons had been words of love and acts of compassion, whose only crime had been demonstrating divine mercy in ways that threatened earthly power structures and challenged assumptions about who deserves grace and who determines worthiness to receive divine favor and acceptance. The betrayal is accomplished through kiss, traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple perverted into signal for arrest, intimacy weaponized for treachery, trust transformed into most infamous act of betrayal in human history that would forever after serve as warning about what happens when hearts choose silver over loyalty, temporary gain over eternal treasure, fear over faith that trusts divine promises, even when circumstances suggest reason for doubt. Yet even in this moment of ultimate rejection, Jesus calls Judas friend, extending grace to very one who is delivering him to his enemies, offering love even to heart that had chosen material gain over spiritual treasure, demonstrating that divine mercy extends even to those who reject it most completely and use positions of trust to inflict maximum damage on love that had accepted them unconditionally. When Peter draws sword and cuts off ear of high priest's servant, Jesus immediately rebukes this attempt at violent resistance, healing wounded man even as his own captors bind his hands with ropes that cannot restrain. Divine love working through apparent defeat to accomplish ultimate victory over sin and death and every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purposes for creation. Put your sword away, he tells Peter with authority that reveals different kind of power than world understands, for all who draw sword will die by sword. His words demonstrate that kingdom of heaven advances through love rather than force, through voluntary submission to divine will rather than violent resistance to earthly opposition, through trust in Heavenly Father's plan rather than human efforts to control outcomes through methods that contradict divine character and purposes. The trials that follow are travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on their verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for predetermined conclusion that would eliminate threat Jesus posed to their authority and influence. They bring forward false witnesses whose testimonies contradict each other, ask trick questions designed to entrap Jesus into statements that could be construed as blasphemy or sedition, ultimately condemning him for crime of claiming to be who he actually was, Son of living God. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in the profound silence that follows Jesus' death. My beloved companion, silence broken only by weeping of those who loved him and awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented in human history. Very fabric of creation seems to hold its breath as earth and heaven process completion of most significant event ever to occur. Voluntary sacrifice of divine love for human redemption. Payment of infinite price for eternal freedom of anyone willing to receive such extravagant grace through simple faith and grateful surrender to love that proved itself on cross. The Roman centurion who supervised crucifixion, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms, through years of military service in various campaigns and under different commanders, finds himself compelled to acknowledge what he has observed with his own eyes and cannot explain through natural means or previous experience with condemned criminals, who usually died cursing their executioners and raging against fate that brought them to such end. Surely this was a righteous man, he declares, and according to some accounts, truly this man was Son of God. Even this hardened military officer, trained to maintain emotional distance from suffering, he was required to oversee as part of his professional duties, cannot remain unmoved by manner of Jesus' death. Forgiveness he extended to his executioners. Dignity he maintained throughout his ordeal that revealed something supernatural about his character and identity. As evening approaches and Sabbath draws near, Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus, finds courage to request permission from Pilate to bury body properly rather than allowing it to be thrown into common grave reserved for executed criminals, whose families could not afford proper burial or whose crimes had made them outcasts even in death. This is act of considerable bravery that publicly identifies him with condemned man and could cost him his position, reputation, possibly his life. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had come to Jesus under cover of darkness, seeking spiritual truth, and had apparently found more than he expected in encounter with one who claimed to be light of world. Joseph carefully removes Jesus' body from cross and prepares it for burial according to Jewish custom that honors dead even when circumstances of death bring shame upon family and community. They wrap body in linen cloths with expensive spices that cost them considerable sum, but represent investment in hope that death is not final word in story of one who claimed to have power over life and death, who promised that he would rise again on third day, though they cannot understand how such thing could be possible according to natural laws and human experience that teaches finality of death for everyone who has ever lived. The tomb where they laid Jesus' body is new one that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved out of rock in garden near place of crucifixion, sealed with massive stone that would require several men to move and guarded by Roman soldiers, posted there at request of religious authorities who remember Jesus' predictions about rising from dead and want to prevent any attempt by his followers to steal body and claim resurrection had occurred. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, watching from distance as he died and noting carefully where his body was laid, planned to return after Sabbath to complete burial preparations that had been performed hastily due to time constraints imposed by approaching holy day observances. Their devotion compels them to perform this final act of love for teacher who had transformed their lives, even though their hearts are breaking with grief and their faith is shattered by apparent failure of everything they had believed and hoped. But while they mourn what appears to be ultimate defeat of love by hatred, life by death, hope by despair that seems to have final word in story that began with such promise and ended with such disappointment, something unprecedented is stirring in tomb where Jesus' body has been laid. something that will transform their grief into joy, their despair into hope, their confusion into clarity about divine love's ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing. Early on first day of week, before dawn has fully broken over Jerusalem, still sleeping in aftermath of Passover, celebration and trauma of witnessing execution that had shaken earth and torn temple veil from top to bottom, Mary Magdalene makes her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body, her heart heavy with sorrow but her devotion compelling her to perform this final act of service for one who had freed her from demonic oppression and given her life meaning and purpose she had never imagined possible before he spoke her name and called her to follow him. She expects to find tomb sealed and guarded, body of her beloved teacher still wrapped in burial cloths, finality of death confirmed by sight of his lifeless form that would force her to accept that even divine love could not overcome human hatred and Roman power backed by religious authority, determined to eliminate anyone who threatened their control over people they claimed to serve, but actually exploited for their own advantage. But when she arrives at Garden Tomb, she discovers something that challenges every assumption about permanence of death and limitation of divine power to overcome forces that seem invincible to human understanding and experience. Massive stone that had sealed entrance is rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken in to steal body, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at angle that suggests it had been moved not by human strength, but by supernatural force. Angels whose very presence transforms tomb into sanctuary of divine glory greet her bewilderment with words that will echo through eternity, bringing hope to every heart that has ever been broken by loss and every soul that has ever wondered whether love is strong enough to overcome death and separation and all forces that threaten to destroy what God has created and called good despite its current brokenness. Why do you look for living among dead? They ask with voices that carry music of heaven into earthly sorrow. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Their invitation to come and see place where he lay becomes invitation to witness evidence that death has been conquered. Grave has been robbed of its victory. Hope is not only restored, but vindicated in most wonderful way imaginable by love that proved stronger than hatred, life that proved more powerful than death. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace. Here at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together through life and love of Jesus Christ. As peaceful darkness of night settles around you like most comforting embrace, and your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest that comes from knowing you are held by arms that will never grow weary of carrying you, I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared. Walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told. Experiencing together love that has changed countless hearts across centuries and continues changing hearts tonight, including yours, my most beloved friend. We began this evening with you carrying weight of another day's struggles, perhaps feeling weary beyond words, possibly questioning your worth or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs, and longest struggles that sometimes feel too heavy for any one person to bear alone. Without divine assistance and supernatural strength that comes from relationship with one who understands every human experience because he chose to enter fully into human existence while never ceasing to be perfectly divine. We conclude with you held securely in embrace of that very love that spoke galaxies into existence, yet numbers every hair on your head. Love that created stars and planets and vast expanses of space, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart that may feel too small to matter to anyone, but matters infinitely to one who gave his life to prove how precious you are to him and how far divine grace will go to purchase your freedom from everything that enslaves and destroys and separates you from abundant life He came to provide. The Jesus we have encountered together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of civilizations that have crumbled into dust, but living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me, who need grace more than we need anything else this world could offer. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances, speaking to your contemporary struggles with same voice that calmed storms and comforted mourners 2,000 years ago, offering sane peace that guards hearts and minds of those who trust in His promises that never fail and His character that never changes, regardless of how situations around us may shift and challenge our faith or test our endurance. The cross we witnessed together was not simply tragic end to beautiful life cut short by human jealousy and religious pride, but ultimate demonstration of divine love willing to pay any price for human redemption. Definitive proof that there is no depth of human need that divine grace cannot reach, no darkness so profound that divine light cannot penetrate it, no heart so broken that divine love cannot heal it completely and restore it to fullness of life and joy and purpose that God intended from beginning. The resurrection we celebrated revealed that this love is not merely beautiful sentiment or inspiring philosophy, but victorious power that conquers every enemy of human happiness and divine purpose. Not wishful thinking, but eternal reality. Not temporary comfort, but permanent transformation. Available to anyone willing to receive it with simple faith that trusts in finished work of Christ rather than human effort or religious performance that always falls short of perfect righteousness required. For fellowship with Holy God, if this sacred journey has brought even moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love that holds universe together and sustains your life moment by moment, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding, worth returning to whenever life becomes overwhelming, worth sharing with others who are searching for same peace you have found tonight. This community of fellow seekers that has formed around these contemplative stories represents something precious and rare in our modern world that often seems designed to fragment attention and fracture peace that souls desperately need to flourish and grow in wisdom and understanding. By joining our family through subscription and participation in ongoing conversation, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption, entering into fellowship with people who have discovered that slowing down reveals more truth than speeding up, that silence teaches more wisdom than noise, that some realities can only be perceived when we create space for them to settle into hearts prepared by stillness. Your voice matters tremendously in sacred conversation we maintain together across continents and cultures. Your reflections and experiences adding unique threads to tapestry of testimony that encourages every heart encountering it to believe in possibilities for transformation and healing that divine love makes available to anyone whose heart remains open to receive such grace. Please share with us in comments below what this journey has meant to you. What particular moments have spoken most directly to your own need? What peace has been awakened in places that had grown accustomed to anxiety or fear? Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort and challenge. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment, and sharing those struggles gives others permission to acknowledge their own need for grace and healing that only God can provide through relationship with Christ, who understands every human experience from inside and offers help that is perfectly suited to our deepest needs. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered God in desert silences and mountain solitudes, learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges that sometimes seem insurmountable but are never beyond reach of grace. Feel now how your body has naturally released every remaining tension, how your breathing has slowed to gentle rhythm of someone who knows they are completely safe in arms that will never let them fall, how your heart has found its natural pace of rest and presence of love that requires nothing from you except willingness to be loved, without reservation or condition or requirement that you earn such love through performance or achievement or demonstration of worthiness that no human being could ever provide. As sleep begins claiming your consciousness, carrying you from wakefulness into blessed unconsciousness, where divine love continues its healing work in regions of your soul too deep for words or awareness to reach. Let your final conscious thoughts be filled with gratitude for this time we have shared, for love you have encountered, for peace that has taken root in your heart like seed that will continue growing even while you sleep. You are falling asleep tonight, not merely into natural rest, but into everlasting arms that have held every believer who has ever found peace in divine love, every heart that has ever been healed by divine grace, every soul that has ever discovered their true identity as beloved children of God, who created them for relationship with Himself and destines them for eternal joy in His presence, where every tear will be wiped away and every sorrow transformed into joy that lasts forever. Sweet dreams, precious child of God, knowing you are beloved beyond your ability to comprehend, accepted beyond your ability to earn, held by love stronger than death and more enduring than time itself. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest, may you know that you are treasured, you are precious, you are exactly who God created you to be. And you are destined for more beauty and joy than your heart can currently imagine, but will experience fully in His perfect timing and according to His perfect plan for your life that is good and not evil, giving you future and hope that nothing can destroy. Rest now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you and will never stop believing in wonderful person you are becoming. Good night, dear one, until we meet again.